This paper has dropped.
Hmm.
This bill by Senator Lummis from Wyoming and Senator Gillibrand. Where's she from? Is she New
New
York?
York.
New
Hmm.
York, yeah. Uh, Bipartisan bill, which some people I've seen reject it today and be very critical of it. I've seen others say, actually, this is great because we've got clarity now. For me, it feels like Senator Lummis, who is pro Bitcoin, is trying to get at the head of the curve here and say, here's some positive legislation to help the industry, progress and flourish, rather than allowing someone else to come in and be too negative. I haven't read the bill. I'm aware of some of the details, specifically the $200 exemption for people to be able to make payments, which is highly very sensible. And I'm aware that there's an inflation clause in it, which is incredible. But you messaged us an hour ago and said we should get into this. So tell me what you've seen within there. What's the good, the bad? What should we be aware of?
Yeah, so I've been following this, as many of us have, for some time, because obviously Senator Lummis in particular, who communicates with many of us in the Bitcoin community, has been sharing that she's working on this and waiting for the final one to drop. With I think the block was it that dropped a draft of it a couple days ago. That was from March. So to see the final version is interesting. And just as a way of background, one of the things that happens with these bills is what they do is they'll share it privately with lobbyists, with stakeholders, with trade associations. So like the Blockchain Association or Coin Center, or maybe even the Bitcoin Policy Institute. They'll go to these various groups and they'll say, hey, we'd like your input on this. They do, they'll do that with FreeOp as well. And people will give feedback, and they'll take some of that feedback and maybe not all of it. And that helps shape the final version of the bill versus what they started with. And so what we see here, I think, is really interesting. I would say that I'm still yet to go through the entire 69 pages of the bill. I've gone through the entire legislative summary. I've gone through some details of the full legislative text. It takes a while because legislative text is very technical. But I would say overall, the way I'd summarize it is it's better than I expected.
Mm-hmm.
So based on conversations I'd had on Capitol Hill with various people prior to the bill, the final draft dropping, there were some things I was concerned about. I feel like overall what I see from the bill is a very clear definition of Bitcoin as a commodity, whose spot price, in terms of exchange and things, is going to be regulated by the CFTC. Not only will Bitcoin be regulated by the CFTC, but kind of a good proportion of the broader cryptocurrency landscape will be regulated by the CFTC. Anything that is not a security as defined in the legislation. So one thing that's really has been a source of sort of a sore point in the broader crypto world, less so with Bitcoin, is this point about is something a security or not. I think what the bill does is create this regulatory framework now where Bitcoin has kind of got a free pass, where Bitcoin is not a security. The law basically makes that very clear. And this is one thing that's really important, particularly for the international audience that doesn't necessarily know this. There's a legislative hierarchy in the U.S. So there's the U.S. Constitution, which is the highest level of law. The next highest level of law are acts of Congress, meaning Congress actually votes on and passes a piece of legislation, and then the president signs it into law. The next level below that for federal law is what we might call regulations. So Congress passes a law, but leaves the details to the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Treasury Department, or if it's not healthcare law, maybe it's Health and Human Services or whatever it is, and they'll fill in with like 1,000-page documents that are lodged before the Federal Register. Okay, here's exactly in nitty-gritty detail how this will work. And the reason I mention all that is that something that is a regulation, or say a Supreme Court precedent, that's one level of law. But if Congress passes a statute, then that is very hard to change. Congress would have to pass another law to change it, or the Supreme Court would have to rule it as unconstitutional. So if this bill were to become law, then the legal status of Bitcoin as a commodity that is not regulated as a security, that has these various features, that has this $200 de minimis transaction sandbox or window, that would be pretty hard to change. And that would create a a stability, a legal stability and recognition of Bitcoin that it has not had to date, that would be pretty powerful, I feel like, for the Bitcoin ecosystem.
Yeah, and for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the clarity here, but
Yeah.
also I think the US will lead the way here. I cannot see a scenario whereby certainly Europe would see a solid argument for making the buying and selling of Bitcoin difficult against the US making, given this regulatory clarity, because it would just put Europe in a disadvantageous position. I think the UK is thankfully separate to that, and we are seeing some politicians come out and start to say a few things pro crypto, let's say, not just Bitcoin. I can think of at least 3 politicians, but I think it puts Europe in a very tricky position if the US gets this clarity regarding it. I have got a bunch of questions.
Go ahead.
So if it falls under the CFTC, what does it actually mean? Like, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, this is one of those things where it's helpful to define some of the landscape. So the legacy financial system has a bunch of different government in the U.S. has a bunch of different government agencies that regulate it. Most places that's not the case. In most countries, there's a single regulatory body that basically has regulatory oversight over stocks, securities, bonds, commodities like oil futures or wheat futures, and digital assets like Bitcoin. It's all part of one agency. And so it's pretty easy for that one agency to kind of do what it needs to do, positively or negatively. In the US, the biggest problem, and a big part of why Bitcoin regulation and crypto regulation more broadly has been a big problem in the US, is that there are actually several different agencies whose jurisdiction somewhat overlaps.
CFTC, SEC.
Yeah, so CFTC stands for the Commodities, Futures, and Trade Commission, and then there's the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then there's the Treasury Department, which is sort of separate from all that. All of them have jurisdiction to a degree over Bitcoin. So, for example, the tax treatment of Bitcoin is regulated by the Treasury Department. Bitcoin being a commodity means that, in theory, the way it should work is exchanges that trade Bitcoin they are commodity exchanges, at least in the context of trading Bitcoin, and in theory should be regulated by the CFTC. But the SEC has also waded into this because the SEC doesn't want to be left out of this conversation. It's kind of a turf war, a land grab, where the SEC commissioners, the SEC leaders, no, this is our turf. We're the ones who are going to regulate, say, an ETF, which is technically a security and exchange traded fund based on Bitcoin. But a big part of why the SEC has held up the approval of a spot Bitcoin ETF is because the spot market for Bitcoin is today it's not clearly regulated by any one of these different alphabet soup agencies that we've talked about. Mm-hmm. So if all of a sudden you have a situation where the Commodities, Futures, and Trade Commission is explicitly charged with regulating the spot Bitcoin market, even though it's obviously a global market where there's exchanges all over the place, all over the world, then the SEC doesn't have that excuse anymore. There is a regulated market for Bitcoin. In fact, what the CFTC could do is say, we certify these 20 or 10 or 5 or 100 exchanges as regulated by the CFTC, compliant with our regulations about KYC, AML, that kind of stuff. And you can use the blended volume weighted average price of Bitcoin on those markets to build your ETF.
I see. Because okay, that makes sense. So Kraken, Coinbase, Gemini, maybe even River, whoever is trading, will they have to become regulated, or could you be an unregulated exchange and your price is included, or will you have to legally be regulated?
If this bill were to become law, then you could obviously have exchanges that are not regulated by the CFTC that are offshore.
Yeah, but right? Within the U.S.
But within the U.S., if you wanted to be a U.S. domiciled company, you'd have to basically register with the CFTC, which has historically been friendlier to crypto than the SEC, at least in the last 5 to 10 years. And the CFTC in general, because they're very accustomed to dealing with these kinds of products in the kind of physical world, like again the wheat futures and the coffee beans and whatnot. For anyone who hasn't watched Trading Places, a classic '80s movie about commodities trading.
Have you seen that, Danny?
No.
Do you even know what it's about?
I mean, Trading Places sounds like it's about trading, but I've got no idea.
So this is an old Eddie Murphy film, right? And he's homeless and he's a bit of a hustler on the street. and these two really old kind of commodities traders have a bet, and they have a bet whether they can turn him into a successful commodities trader. Turns out the bet was like, was it $1?
It was $1.
It's $1. And so they get Eddie Murphy
Kind of
off the
spoiler alert. Yeah.
and they throw him in the back of his taxi, and then he starts explaining how poor people think and what that impact that has on prices. So they end up turning him into a trader, and he goes from like homeless, and he's like, I'm blind. He's on that little thing, pulling himself around. He gets all suited, booted, becomes a successful trader. But in doing so,
they also make one of the waspy successul traders. They basically fire him and make him homeless.
Yeah, that was
Dan Aykroyd.
Dan Aykroyd, Dan Aykroyd, and so Dan Aykroyd goes to being homeless and like stealing, and Eddie Murphy becomes super successful. But he then forgets his roots, and then they end up coming together, don't they?
Yeah, they kind of. Yeah,
it sounds like the most 80s movie of all
it
time.
is.
It's a great 80s movie,
brilliant.
and it's very entertaining, and it does actually a decent job of explaining how commodity trading works. So
It's
if you want sort of
futures, right? Is it the orange futures?
I think it was like foreign frozen concentrated orange juice plays a central role in the plot. So anyway, all this to say that if you want to understand commodities trading in an entertaining 2-hour film, go watch Trading Places, and it'll give you some sense of what the CFTC regulates.
I've been to the CFTC.
Ah,
yeah, I interviewed Brian Quintenz in there.
There you go.
Yeah, and I've been to the SEC. I interviewed Hester Peirce there. Very intimidating places, but that's great. So what you're saying is there is a path now here for exchanges to be regulated, and therefore for the spot ETF to be launched, which this SEC itself can also then regulate it because they have the prices from the regulated exchanges. And I guess the regulation will have some kind of restrictions upon the exchanges and requirements for reporting.
Right. And there will be KYC, AML, and all that stuff. And again, like, hardcore anarcho-libertarians will say, oh, that's, it's terrible that we have that. But I would say that there's no way in the context of a society like ours for legitimate Bitcoin businesses, legitimate, the word literally means legal, right? Legitimate. For legal businesses to operate and interact with the fiat world unless you have some of these rails in place. And so that's really important. So those are some of the really encouraging things about the bill from what I can see. There are some elements that are sort of neutral and some elements that I'm more concerned about. So the neutral elements are, one thing I was really worried about over the last several months is how the bill was going to treat CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, which we've talked about before. Mm-hmm. And I'm very concerned about as a venue for totalitarianism and the surveillance state in the U.S. And original versions of the bill, under my understanding, were going to at least imply that the Fed would be, they were going to kind of give some sort of license or permission to the Fed to build a CBDC that would be quote unquote limited in scope to just Fed interaction with the big banks. And I was very concerned and made this opinion known to the relevant people that that's very risky, because if you let the Federal Reserve build a CBDC that can interact with only like JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo or whatever, it's very easy to go from that to something that then replaces the US dollar and everyone is required, every American is required to use. Once you've actually done the hard work of building the 90% version of the CBDC, going from 90% to 100% is very easy. And so, though I still need to dig through the text to make sure this is the case, I'm encouraged and hopeful that the bill does not explicitly encourage a CBDC. I was also hoping the bill would explicitly prohibit the Federal Reserve from building a CBDC. Make that very clear that that's not in the Federal Reserve's mandate. The bill does not do that in its current form. What it does do is it creates it requires the Fed and relevant people to basically do a study of the Chinese CBDC to see what are what are its features or what are its risks, et cetera, in privacy and in other ways.
Well, I would hope we wouldn't be taking tips from the Chinese model for surveillance capital.
Yeah, let's hope so. There are differing views in the Fed about this. There are people in the Fed who are very excited about CBDC. So all that to say that the language on CBDCs in the bill, from what I've seen, is better than I expected in that it's not pro-CBDC, but it's not anti-CBDC either. It's sort of neutral. Let's study the issue and see what goes on. But that's better than it was before. So I see that as an improvement, but still sort of neutral. There's also a directive for government agencies to study the energy consumption of proof of work, blah, 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 blah. So that's going to be something for all of us who believe that proof of work is an important feature for Bitcoin to keep an eye on.
Well, I also think, look, with regards to proof of work, the trend is to be that miners are moving towards more renewable forms of energy. And I know people would be like, don't acquiesce to this. But at the same time, there are, I believe, and others believe, and Andrew Desler, who we had on the show yesterday, a climate scientist, believe that we are warming the planet is an issue. So, like, I think a study is fair. I just think we shouldn't be, for example, how Nick Carter highlighted the regulations in New York. They're essentially picking and winning, picking who can, what data centers can do. Is essentially the thing. So, I as long as it's a study, and then there's some intelligence behind it, and they don't start penalizing miners or banning miners from using certain sources of fuel, because I think that's hard to enforce anyway, especially if the miners are buying from a grid which has a mixed source of input. Okay, fine. Well, listen, progress and clarity, and it's a place I never thought we would be in. I always felt like, 4 or 5 years ago, I was trading Bitcoin. I always felt like there's going to come a time where they're going to clamp down on this. But actually,
Well, that's why this bill is really important, because there's this term regulatory clarity. You hear it in think tank circles a lot, and it does matter, because if you're trying to start a business, you've got your 1031 hat on. 1031 invest in Bitcoin businesses, right? If you're trying to start a business in the Bitcoin space, you really want to know if what you're doing is legal or not. That's pretty important. If you're going to ask other people to give you hundreds of millions of dollars, hopefully, to start this business and get it going, they don't want to throw their money down the drain if that business is going to turn out to be illegal because some commissioner at the SEC woke up on the wrong side of the bed that day, right? So having clarity is incredibly important to businesses. And if we want there to be a robust ecosystem of Bitcoin businesses that serve our community, then it's really important to have regulatory clarity.